There are women who carry silence like a second skin, not because they were born quiet, but because the world taught them that speaking had a cost. She was one of them, not fragile, not cold, not broken in the way people imagine brokenness to be. She had simply learned, through years of small rejections and forgotten moments, that her voice didn't always deserve the space it took up. It wasn't a single wound that shaped her. It was the accumulation. The birthday texts left unanswered, the plans made around her absence, the conversations that continued as if she'd never spoken at all. Each one felt minor in isolation, like a single raindrop on glass. But over time, they gathered into something heavier, something that pressed against her chest until staying silent felt easier than trying to be heard. She used to knock on doors, not literally but emotionally, reaching out, showing up, trying to prove she belonged in spaces that never quite made room for her. She remembered the parties where her laughter blended into the background noise, the group chats that fell quiet when she contributed, the moments when someone's eyes would glaze over mid-sentence as she spoke. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more subtle, more corrosive, indifference dressed up as politeness. And for years she told herself stories to make sense of it. Maybe she was too serious. Maybe she wasn't interesting enough. Maybe if she just tried a little harder, spoke a little softer, laughed a little louder, someone would finally choose her first. But the door never opened. It just stayed closed, patient and unmoved until she stopped knocking altogether. The silence didn't arrive as a decision. It crept in slowly, like winter fog settling over still water. One day she simply stopped expecting replies, stopped offering herself up for plans that would inevitably change without her, stopped explaining her thoughts when she could see the disinterest flickering behind someone's polite nod. It wasn't bitterness that silenced her, it was preservation, the kind of quiet that forms when you've spent too long shouting into an empty room and finally realize that the echo was never an answer. She became someone who observed more than she participated, who smiled gently, but rarely spoke unless directly asked. And even then, her words came measured, careful, as if she were rationing something precious that had been wasted too many times before. People began to describe her as mysterious, self-contained, peacefully independent. They didn't know she had simply stopped believing that her presence mattered enough to demand acknowledgement. But here's the truth. No one tells you about learned silence. It doesn't erase the longing. It just teaches you to hide it better. Late at night, when the world went quiet and there was no one left to perform calm for, she still felt it. The ache of wanting to be seen, chosen, remembered without having to remind anyone she existed. She still noticed when someone's face lit up for another person in a way it never did for her. Still felt the small, sharp sting when plans were made in front of her for a gathering she wasn't invited to. The difference was that she no longer showed it. She had learned to wear her loneliness like a well-tailored coat, elegant, unremarkable, impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. And most people didn't look, because a woman who doesn't ask for anything is easy to forget. So she built a life in the margins, not a smaller life exactly, but a quieter one. One that didn't require anyone else's validation to exist. She stopped waiting for text messages that never came, stopped refreshing social media to see if anyone had noticed her absence, stopped crafting perfect responses in her head for conversations that would never happen. Instead, she filled her days with small, solitary comforts, books that didn't judge her silences, walks where no one expected her to perform joy, routines that belonged only to her. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was survival. And sometimes, survival is the bravest thing a heart can do. She had learned to live in a world that didn't choose her. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have imagined in those long, quiet nights, was that someone was coming who wouldn't need her to knock at all. There's a particular kind of strength that women are praised for, and it's the kind that asks for nothing. She had become an expert at it, the art of being low maintenance, unbothered, effortlessly independent. People admired her for it, told her how impressive it was that she never seemed to need anyone, never created drama, never made her pain anyone else's problem. What they didn't see was the price she paid for that composure. Because strength, when it's born from rejection rather than choice, isn't really strength at all. It's a costume you wear so well that eventually you forget there's still a person underneath, waiting to be held without having to ask for it first. She had learned to be the woman who didn't complain, who didn't demand explanations when plans changed at the last minute, who didn't question why she was always the one reaching out first, who didn't express disappointment when promises dissolved into convenient forgetfulness. She told herself it was maturity, emotional intelligence, the mark of someone who understood that people were busy, that life was complicated, that expecting too much only led to hurt. But somewhere beneath that polished exterior, a quieter truth lived. She wasn't being understanding. She was being afraid. Afraid that if she asked for more, she'd be labeled difficult. Afraid that if she voiced her needs, she'd confirm what she'd always suspected, that she simply wasn't worth the effort. So she smiled through the small abandonments, laughed off the casual dismissals, and built a reputation as the girl who was always fine, always easy, always okay with whatever everyone else decided. But here's what happens when you become too easy to overlook. You start to disappear even to yourself. She found herself in relationships, both romantic and platonic, where she was perpetually accommodating, perpetually flexible, perpetually waiting for someone to notice that she was bending so far she'd forgotten her own shape. She dated men who called her chill because she never asked where the relationship was going, never expressed hurt when they cancelled plans, never expected consistency because she'd learned that expecting anything was a setup for disappointment. She had friends who loved her presence, but never thought to check on her absence, who leaned on her during their crises, but somehow never had space when she needed support. And the worst part? She couldn't even blame them, because she had trained everyone in her life to believe that she didn't need anything, that her heart was a fortress that required no tending, that her silence was contentment rather than resignation. It was like living in a house where she'd turned off all the lights to avoid being seen, only to realize years later that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be illuminated. She moved through her days with a strange sort of numbness, a protective layer that kept the sharp edges of loneliness from cutting too deep, but also kept joy from reaching her fully. Celebrations felt muted, connections felt surface level. Even moments that should have been beautiful arrived with a faint sense of distance, as if she were watching her own life through frosted glass. She told herself this was peace, that she'd finally achieved the emotional independence everyone claimed to want. But late at night, when the performance ended and she was alone with her thoughts, she knew the truth. This wasn't peace. It was just a quieter kind of ache, one that had learned to stop making noise. The cruelest part of being strong in this way is that people stop seeing your humanity. They stop considering that you might be tired, that you might long for someone to pursue you the way you've always pursued others, that you might want to be someone's first thought instead of their convenient option. She became a supporting character in everyone else's story, reliable, steady, forgettable. The friend who always showed up but whose birthday people had to be reminded of. The partner who gave everything and somehow made it look effortless, so no one thought to ask if she was running on empty. The daughter, the co-worker, the neighbor who could always be counted on because she never said no, never drew boundaries, never admitted that she was drowning in her own accommodating silence. And somewhere along the way she stopped recognizing herself. The woman in the mirror looked composed, together, unshakably fine. But the woman inside was still that girl who once knocked on doors, hoping someone would finally open one and say, "I've been waiting for you." What she didn't understand yet, what would take years and one very specific person to teach her, was that real strength isn't about needing nothing. It's about knowing you deserve to need something and not apologizing for it. It's about understanding that your worth isn't measured by how little space you take up, but by the fullness of who you are when you finally stop shrinking. She wasn't there yet. She was still living in the in-between, in that exhausting place where you're too tired to keep trying, but too conditioned to stop. But something was shifting slowly, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of her carefully constructed calm. She was approaching a kind of emotional exhaustion that would either break her completely or force her into a different kind of silence. Not the silence of self-erasure, but the silence of someone who has finally stopped performing and started waiting for something real. There comes a moment in every long silence when something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing softly in an empty room. For her, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in every way except for the realization that settled over her like dust. She wasn't heartbroken anymore. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She had simply stopped expecting anything at all. Not from people, not from love, not from the universe that seemed to hand out connection so easily to everyone but her. It wasn't surrender in the way people imagine it. No tears, no declarations, no dramatic turning point. It was quieter than that, more complete. It was the kind of letting go that happens when you've carried something so long that setting it down doesn't feel like loss. It just feels like relief. She stopped looking at her phone with that small flutter of hope every time it buzzed, stopped crafting perfect responses in her mind for conversations that would never happen, stopped imagining scenarios where someone finally saw her, chose her, made her feel like she'd been worth the wait all along. The fantasy had exhausted itself, worn thin from years of being replayed with different faces, different settings, always ending the same way, with her alone wondering what was wrong with her that made her so easy to walk away from. But now, in this new quiet space she'd entered, even that question had lost its urgency. Maybe nothing was wrong with her. Maybe some people were just meant to walk through life without being anyone's first choice, and maybe that was okay. Maybe she could build something meaningful out of her solitude, something that didn't require anyone else's validation to exist. Maybe she could finally stop waiting. The change showed in small ways that no one else noticed. She stopped saying yes to invitations that felt obligatory, stopped maintaining friendships that only existed when she did all the work, stopped dating men who liked the idea of her but never bothered to know the reality. She wasn't being cold or bitter. She was just done pretending that crumbs felt like nourishment. When someone showed lukewarm interest, she no longer tried to warm it into something real. When plans fell through, she no longer rearranged her life to accommodate someone else's convenience. When conversations felt one-sided, she simply let them end. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. And for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Not the joyful, expansive kind, but the calm, neutral kind that comes when you stop fighting against what is and simply accept it. She began to tend to her own life, the way someone might tend to a garden they'd long neglected. Carefully, without expectation of bloom, just grateful for green. She took walks without documenting them for an audience, read books that made her feel something, even if she had no one to discuss them with, cooked meals for one without the apologetic weight of loneliness pressing on her chest, decorated her small apartment in a way that pleased only her, filled with soft textures and warm light that asked nothing of her except to exist within it. Her days became her own in a way they'd never been before, not because she'd chosen solitude, but because she'd stopped resisting it. And in that acceptance, something unexpected happened. The constant ache that had lived beneath her ribs for years began to quiet. Not disappear, but soften into something manageable, something she could live with. People who knew her casually might have said she seemed lighter, more present, as if she'd finally found some secret to contentment. But the truth was more complex than that. She hadn't found happiness. She'd found neutrality. She'd stopped oscillating between hope and disappointment and landed somewhere in the middle, a flat emotional landscape where nothing hurt too much because nothing mattered too much. It was sustainable in a way that yearning never was, practical in a way that hope never could be. She could function here, build a life here, maybe even find moments of genuine pleasure in small things that asked nothing of her heart. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was younger, when she still believed that love was something everyone eventually found, but it was a life she could live without breaking. And for someone who'd spent years carefully holding her own pieces together, that felt like enough. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she moved through those quiet, self-contained days, was that this was exactly the moment when everything would change. Not because she'd finally become perfect enough to deserve love, not because she'd manifested it through positive thinking or self-improvement, but because she'd stopped performing. She'd stopped trying to be what she thought someone might want, and had simply become who she was when no one was watching, a little tired, a little guarded, but still soft in the places that mattered, still capable of warmth, even if she'd learned to keep it close, still willing to be surprised, even if she'd stopped expecting it. And it was this version of her, unpolished, unperforming, entirely herself, that would finally catch the attention of someone who'd been looking for exactly that kind of quiet authenticity all along. He arrived the way real things often do, without fanfare, without the dramatic timing she'd imagined in all those years of waiting. There was no lightning bolt of recognition, no cinematic moment where their eyes met across a crowded room and the world fell away. He was just there one day, steady and unremarkable in the best possible way, like sunlight filtering through a window she hadn't realized was open. They met through the kind of ordinary circumstance that wouldn't make a good story, a mutual friends gathering, a casual introduction, a conversation that started about nothing in particular and somehow never quite ended. She noticed him, of course, but not in the breathless way she'd noticed men before. She noticed the way he listened when other people spoke, the way his presence didn't demand attention, but somehow made the room feel calmer, the way he seemed comfortable in his own skin in a way that had nothing to prove. What struck her most in those early interactions was his lack of performance. He didn't try to impress her with accomplishments or charm her with rehearsed wit. He didn't fill every silence with words or treat conversation like a game he needed to win. When she spoke, he actually heard her, not just the words but the meaning beneath them, the hesitations, the carefully chosen phrases that revealed more than she intended. And when she went quiet, as she often did, he didn't rush to fill the space or interpret her silence as disinterest. He just existed alongside it, as if her quietness was something to be respected rather than fixed. It was so unfamiliar that at first she didn't trust it. She waited for the shift, the moment when his patience would run out, and he'd reveal himself to be just like all the others, charming until it required effort, interested until it required consistency. But the shift never came. Instead, there was just more of the same steady presence week after week, interaction after interaction. He texted when he said he would, showed up when he said he'd be there, remembered small details she'd mentioned in passing, the book she'd been reading, the way she took her coffee, the fact that she liked rainy mornings because they gave her permission to stay inside without feeling guilty about it. These weren't grand gestures, they were barely gestures at all, but to someone who'd spent years being forgotten, being deprioritized, being treated as optional, they felt like a foreign language she was slowly learning to understand. He didn't make her feel like she was too much or not enough. He made her feel like she was exactly right, exactly as she was, without needing to adjust herself to fit into his life. The first time she realized something was different was during a group dinner where everyone was talking over each other, voices competing for attention in that exhausting way social gatherings often demanded. She'd gone quiet as she always did in those situations, content to observe from the edges while others took up space. But then she felt it, his attention, gentle and unhurried, turning toward her in the middle of someone else's story. He didn't interrupt the flow of conversation or make a show of it. He simply leaned slightly in her direction and asked, quietly enough that only she could hear, "What do you think about all this?" It was such a small thing, barely worth mentioning, but it cracked something open inside her, some locked room she'd forgotten existed, because he wasn't asking to be polite. He was asking because he actually wanted to know, because her thoughts mattered to him, even when she hadn't offered them, because he'd noticed her silence and recognized it not as absence but as presence. She started letting him in slowly, cautiously, the way someone might test the temperature of water before committing to swim. She expected him to lose interest when she didn't perform excitement, when she didn't fill their time together with constant entertainment, when she admitted that sometimes she just wanted to exist quietly in the same room without the pressure of conversation. But he didn't pull back. If anything, he seemed to relax into it, as if her authenticity gave him permission to be equally unhurried, equally himself. They fell into a rhythm that felt nothing like the relationships she'd forced herself into before. No games, no tests, no constant wondering where she stood. He was clear without being overwhelming, present without being consuming, affectionate in ways that felt natural rather than performative. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, she began to believe that maybe this was real. Maybe this was what it felt like to be chosen, not because you'd convinced someone, but because they'd actually seen you and wanted to stay. The most revolutionary thing about him wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. He didn't make her prove her worth, didn't make her compete for his attention, didn't treat her kindness as weakness or her silence as indifference. He didn't need her to be louder, brighter, more available, more agreeable. He just needed her to be honest, and he met that honesty with a steadiness that felt for the first time in her life like home. Not the home she'd imagined when she was younger. No fireworks, no desperate passion, no dramatic declarations. Just a quiet, solid sense of safety that whispered again and again in 1,000 small ways, "You don't have to perform here. You don't have to shrink here. You can just be, exactly as you are, and that will always be enough." The change didn't happen all at once. It was more like thawing, slow, imperceptible at first, and then suddenly she'd noticed that something inside her had softened in a way she couldn't quite name. Her body stopped carrying tension in places she hadn't realized were tight. Her mind stopped running through worst-case scenarios every time he texted, stopped bracing for disappointment, stopped waiting for the inevitable moment when he'd realize she wasn't worth the effort. The hypervigilance that had become second nature began to quiet, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed, the ability to simply receive without calculating the cost. She found herself laughing more easily, not the performed laughter of someone trying to be likable, but the genuine kind that surprised her with its lightness. She found herself speaking without rehearsing every word first, trusting that he wouldn't weaponize her vulnerability or store her admissions for later use. She was learning, slowly and carefully, what it felt like to be safe with another person. What surprised her most wasn't his consistency, though that was remarkable in itself. It was the way he loved her quietness instead of trying to fix it. He never treated her silences as something broken or her need for solitude as rejection. When she went inward, as she often did, he didn't take it personally or create drama around her emotional rhythms. He simply let her be, maintaining his presence without demanding she justify her need for space. And somehow, paradoxically, that lack of pressure made her want to open up more. She started sharing things she'd kept carefully guarded for years, her fears about being forgettable, her belief that she was somehow fundamentally unworthy of being chosen, the way rejection had carved itself so deep into her identity that she'd stopped being able to imagine anything different. He listened to all of it with a gentleness that never tipped into pity, acknowledging her pain without trying to argue her out of it or convince her she was wrong to feel what she felt. The intimacy they built wasn't the explosive, all-consuming kind she'd once believed was the only valid form of passion. It was quieter than that, more sustainable, the kind of connection that grew stronger through repetition rather than intensity. They developed small rituals that belonged only to them, morning coffee in comfortable silence, evening walks where they pointed out things they found beautiful without needing to explain why, Saturday afternoons where they existed in the same space doing separate things, connected by proximity rather than constant interaction. He learned which days she needed to be pulled gently out of her own head and which days she needed to be left alone in it. She learned that his steadiness wasn't indifference, but a different expression of care, one that didn't require constant verbal affirmation to exist. They were learning each other's languages, and for the first time in her life, someone was actually putting in the effort to become fluent in hers. There was a specific moment when she realized she'd fallen in love with him, though fallen felt like the wrong word for something that had happened so gradually. They were doing nothing remarkable, making dinner together in her small kitchen, moving around each other with the easy choreography of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. He was chopping vegetables while she stirred something on the stove, and the radio played softly in the background, some song she'd forget the moment it ended. And suddenly, in the middle of that ordinary moment, she felt it, a deep sense of rightness, of belonging, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anything extraordinary was happening, but because nothing needed to be extraordinary. The ordinariness itself was the gift, the fact that she could exist in her quietness, in her unpolished reality, and he was still there, still choosing to stay, still treating her presence as something valuable rather than something to be tolerated. She started to understand that this was what love looked like when it wasn't tangled up with anxiety and performance and the desperate need to prove yourself worthy. It was calm in a way that felt almost revolutionary after years of chaos. There were no dramatic ups and downs, no toxic cycles of push and pull, no moments where she had to wonder if he actually cared or was just bored and passing time. He showed up consistently, loved her visibly, and created a relationship where she could finally exhale. And in that exhale, in that long-awaited release of tension she'd been holding for years, she discovered parts of herself she'd forgotten existed. She was funny, she realized, when she wasn't so busy monitoring every word for potential rejection. She was affectionate when she didn't have to ration her warmth out of fear it wouldn't be returned. She was playful and creative and full of ideas when she trusted that her enthusiasm wouldn't be mocked or dismissed. This wasn't just a relationship, it was a reclamation. With him, she was slowly recovering all the parts of herself she'd learned to hide, all the softness she'd armored over, all the hope she'd been afraid to hold. She wasn't healed in some complete, permanent way. Healing isn't linear, and old wounds have a way of aching even years after they've closed. But she was different. She moved through the world with less weight, smiled with less guardedness, loved with less fear. And on the days when the old patterns tried to resurface, when her mind whispered that this couldn't possibly last, that she wasn't actually enough, that he'd eventually see what everyone else had seen and leave, on those days he was there, not fixing her, not dismissing her fears, just holding space for both her doubt and her hope, reminding her through his presence that some people do stay. Some people do choose you. And sometimes after years of silence, you finally meet someone who doesn't need you to be loud to know you're there. So here's what she learned. After all those years of silence, after all that time spent believing she was the problem, love doesn't require you to disappear in order to fit. Real love, the kind that actually sustains you rather than drains you, makes space for exactly who you are. It doesn't ask you to be louder if quiet is your nature. It doesn't punish you for needing time alone or for processing emotions slowly. It doesn't treat your boundaries as obstacles or your needs as inconveniences. Real love sees your silence and doesn't mistake it for absence. It understands that some people feel most deeply in the quiet spaces, that some hearts speak in gestures rather than grand declarations, that being reserved isn't the same as being cold. She learned this not through words or promises, but through the daily, unglamorous practice of being loved by someone who never asked her to be different. The truth is, she didn't stop being the woman who'd learned to stay silent. Those years didn't erase themselves just because someone finally saw her. The instinct to shrink, to accommodate, to expect disappointment, it still surfaced sometimes, particularly in moments of stress or vulnerability. Old wounds have a way of aching long after they've healed, and the patterns we develop to survive don't disappear overnight. But the difference now was that she had someone who recognized those patterns, who understood where they came from, and who gently, consistently reminded her that she didn't need them anymore. Not with him. Not in this relationship that had been built on mutual respect rather than one-sided effort. She was learning slowly that healing isn't about erasing your past. It's about building a present where your past doesn't have to dictate your future. What changed most profoundly wasn't her circumstances. It was her understanding of what she deserved. For years, she'd been operating from a place of scarcity, believing that love was something you had to earn through perfect behavior, constant availability, and the suppression of any need that might inconvenience someone else. She'd treated relationships like auditions where she was perpetually trying to prove she was worth keeping, where one wrong move might reveal her as unworthy and justifiably discarded. But being loved steadily, being chosen consistently, being valued simply for existing, it rewrote something fundamental in her. It showed her that the problem was never that she was too much or not enough. The problem was that she'd been offering her authentic self to people who were only interested in convenient versions of love, people who wanted connection without depth, presence without commitment, affection without the work that real intimacy requires. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that she found someone who saved her, but that she survived long enough to recognize real love when it finally arrived. Because here's what no one tells you about healing from years of rejection. It doesn't make you suddenly confident or fearless or free from doubt. What it does is give you a comparison point. It shows you what healthy feels like, so you can finally recognize how unhealthy everything before it was. She could look back now at all those relationships that had left her feeling depleted and see them clearly for what they were. Not love, but proximity. Not connection, but convenience. Not partnership, but performance. And she could honor her younger self for surviving those experiences without becoming bitter, for keeping her heart soft even when it would have been easier to let it harden, for continuing to hope even when hope felt foolish. So what do you do with a story like this? What do you take from watching someone move from invisibility to being seen, from silence to being heard, from surviving to actually living? Maybe you recognize yourself in her early years and you're still there, still waiting, still wondering if anyone will ever choose you the way you've watched them choose other people. If that's you, here's what she would want you to know. Your silence doesn't make you broken. Your need for depth doesn't make you difficult. Your history of being overlooked doesn't mean you're forgettable. It means you've been looking in the wrong places, offering your light to people who were too distracted to notice it. Keep going, not because there's a guarantee that someone will find you, but because you deserve to live fully regardless of whether anyone witnesses it. Build a life that feels meaningful to you. Tend to your own heart. Create beauty in the small, ordinary moments. And if someone comes along who actually sees you, really sees you, you'll know, because you won't have to convince them of your worth. They'll simply recognize it. Or maybe you see yourself in him, the person who finally loved her well. Maybe you've been that steady presence for someone, creating safety where they'd only known chaos, offering consistency where they'd been conditioned to expect abandonment. If that's you, understand the gift you're giving. Understand that for someone who spent years believing they were fundamentally unlovable, your simple act of staying, of showing up, of choosing them again and again, without making it feel like a burden, that's revolutionary. You're not just building a relationship. You're rewriting someone's understanding of what they deserve. You're proving that not everyone leaves, that some people actually mean what they say, that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. Keep being that person. Keep offering that kind of love. Because in a world that teaches people to guard themselves through constant disappointment, being someone's safe place is perhaps the most profound thing you can be. And if you're somewhere in between, if you've been hurt but you're healing, if you've learned to be silent but you're slowly finding your voice again, if you're tired but not quite ready to give up, just know that your story isn't over. This moment, this quiet, careful place you're in right now, it's not failure. It's preparation. You're learning to distinguish between people who want to know you and people who just want to be entertained. You're developing boundaries that will protect you without closing you off completely. You're discovering what you're willing to accept and what you're brave enough to walk away from. This is holy work, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. Because on the other side of this, not immediately, not magically, but eventually, there's a version of you who knows her worth so deeply that she won't settle for anything that asks her to forget it. Some love stories don't begin with fireworks, they begin with exhale, with the relief of finally being met where you are instead of where someone wishes you would be, with the radical experience of not having to translate yourself to be understood, with the quiet realization that you're safe here, that you can rest here, that you don't have to perform here. That's the love worth waiting for. That's the love that doesn't ask you to disappear in order to fit. And that's the love that whispers over and over in 1,000 different ways. You were never the problem. You were just waiting for someone who actually knew how to see you. If this story touched something in you, if it named a feeling you've been carrying for years without knowing what to call it, leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, people who need to hear that their silence doesn't mean they're broken, that their history of being overlooked doesn't define their future, that somewhere out there is someone who will choose them without needing to be convinced first. And subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Stories about love, rejection, healing, and the messy, beautiful process of learning to hope again. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we post something new. Because every week we're here telling stories for the people who've felt invisible, who've loved too much and been given too little, who are still learning to believe they deserve more. And if there's someone in your life who's learned to stay silent, someone who shrinks themselves to fit into other people's convenience, someone who needs to hear that they're not asking for too much when they ask to be loved well, share this video with them. Sometimes we need to hear our own story told by someone else before we can recognize that what we're experiencing isn't normal, isn't okay, and definitely isn't our fault. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, being seen shouldn't hurt, and your silence when you've finally found the right person can be heard louder than any words you've ever spoken. Some people know how to listen with more than their ears. Those are your people. Keep waiting for them. They're worth it.